fine. They don't generate liability to attack because we only have a contingent preparation to attack, which is based on the fact that they are planning to attack us in a non-contingent way. Well, I think that is a meaningful distinction. There clearly is distinction to be made between those two different ways of thinking about planning for attack. But I think the problem here is that it's very, very difficult to see how a rule based on that distinction could be operable in international relations. We know that modern states have standing armies. Those armies constantly engage in planning activities for military action, both for defensive and offensive military action. So the kind of preparation side of it, I think, has to be taken as read. Everything will then turn on these very, very fine-tuned assessments of what the intentionality of the partner is, right? Were they planning to attack us only because we expressed our doctrine of preemptive action because they heard this axis of evil attention? So is their intention to attack us conditional in that sense, or is it unconditional? Were they planning to attack us irrespective of our intentions and our doctrines of preemption? It seems to me that a rule that was based on that kind of incredibly fine-tuned assessment of the intentionality of partners is one that could very, very rarely be operable in international relations. In addition, I think there's going to be a very significant question about whether the liability that is assumed by that kind of wrongful, unconditional intention, whether that will actually apply to the people that we will have to, at the end of the day, attack and kill in a military action. Because, you can imagine two cases, right? You can imagine a case where the intention to plan a criminal conspiracy to attack is spread right throughout the armed forces, right? So it's not only the very senior leadership, but all of the soldiers as well who are engaged in planning and preparation to engage in an attack at some point in the future. Well, if that's the case, that looks very much like a case of an imminent threat, right? If all of the soldiers and the whole military apparatus are engaged in this planning activity, that looks very much like a case of imminent attack, in which case it wouldn't be an act of prevention at all. It would be much more like a 1967 style case of preemption. Much more likely is going to be a case where this planning, this non-conditional conspiracy, as I called it, is actually limited to the very, very high echelons of leadership, right? It's going to be taking place at the level of the political elite, perhaps the very, very senior members of the armed forces. The ordinary soldiers, presumably, are going to be doing what they always do. They're going to be engaging in their normal, legitimate barracks activities. Now, if that's the case, it's very hard to understand how those soldiers can be liable to be attacked and killed. If there is a conspiracy, but it's occurring at the level of the leadership, not at the level of those soldiers, if those soldiers are doing nothing more than they would normally be entitled to do in barracks activities, how can we explain that they have done something that makes them liable to action, to military action? So I think that when we think about it in this context, we can see that there really is a very, very profound issue with preventive action. And I just want to point out one way in which this connects quite nicely, I think, with Jean's remarks. Jean said that the way that she was thinking about preventive action is it might be analogous to the way that Michael Walzer thinks about supreme emergency. Now, if I'm right in saying that the main problem with preventive military action is that it kills people who are not liable to be killed because they haven't yet done anything wrongful to make themselves liable, that would explain, I think, Jean's intuition. Because those people, those soldiers who haven't done anything on my account to make themselves liable to be killed are very much like the civilians, the non-combatants that Michael Walzer is worried about in his account of supreme emergency. Now, I think probably Jean and I probably part company in that I'm much more skeptical of the idea that there is a permission to attack non-combatants in cases of supreme emergency. But if what I've said here is right, that would at least explain why Jean might be right to say that we should think about cases of supreme emergency and cases of preventive war in a very similar way. So I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
Very good indeed. Thank you, David. Our next speaker this morning is Steve Ward. Steve is currently the CIA visiting professor here at the United States Naval Academy, working in the Leadership, Ethics, and Law Department in the Stockdale Center. Steve has spent 25 years in the Central Intelligence Agency, serving in a variety of assignments in analytics, managerial, and policy positions. His work has focused primarily on the Middle East, and his assignments have included as Director for Intelligence Programs at the National Security Council, as well as Deputy National Intelligence Officer for Near East Affairs on the National Intelligence Council. Steve is the author of Immortal, A Military History of Iran and its Armed Forces, and has published as well broadly, particularly on the Middle East. Now, the most important thing you need to know about Steve, though, is Steve is a retired Army Lieutenant Colonel, a graduate of the United States Military Academy here at West Point, as am I, proving once again how hospitable the United States Naval Academy is in their desire to maintain a high level of discourse. Steve, over to you.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. As you may have gathered from Colonel McCausland's very kind introduction, I'm not a philosopher, I'm not an ethicist, I'm definitely not a lawyer, but as he indicated, I'm an intelligence officer and specifically an intelligence analyst. That's one of the reasons why I'm really a little bit daunted this morning daunted at the prospect of speaking to you all and being part of this distinguished panel and conference. But I was asked to be here. I was asked to come after a series of conversations over in Luce Hall at the Stockdale Center about my experiences as one of the senior military analysts working on Iraq in the run-up to the invasion of that country in 2002 and 2003. And those conversations struck some people as interesting, and so what I'm going to be talking about in my short time here is sort of the perspective, if you would, from the working level of someone trying to support the national security policies of the United States about preventive war, or war in general, using Iraq as an example. And actually, it might be more correct to say that I was asked to talk about the reasons the CIA was not called explicitly to consider just war criteria during the pre-invasion period. Let me emphasize that my experience represents at best a keyhole view of the events of that time. I don't really know more than what I experienced firsthand, and I do not presume to know all the considerations that senior policymakers and senior officials at my own agency used in their deliberations. Nonetheless, I present my views to you in the hope that some will find them useful, if not interesting. Before I go further, I also must say, as a serving CIA officer, that these are my views alone. They do not represent the official positions of the CIA or any other U.S. government agency. In addition, although my remarks have been reviewed by the CIA, nothing I say should be construed to represent U.S. government authentication or agency endorsement of my views. So now that I got that disclaimer out of the way, I can begin. To start, I was actually a little bit surprised in our discussions in Luce Hall that there was interest in what I was saying about CIA and the lack of any official consideration there about the wisdom or morality of going to war. Part of the reason for my surprise was that having lived it and avidly read many of the post-war memoirs and histories, I thought these issues were well understood, or at least well discussed. In particular, I thought it was common knowledge that the decision to go to war with Iraq apparently never received a fraction of the attention given by policymakers to the issues of how to go to war or how to explain the use of military force to the American people. But on reflection, I recognize that in the context of the time, which made such an approach understandable to CIA officers and others working on Iraq, it may not have been as clear to other people who weren't deeply involved in the process. Also, it occurred to me that most people outside the intelligence community may not know how we view the roles of strategic intelligence, ethics, and the values of analytic objectivity and integrity. Ethics, by the way, is not foreign to CIA. It's part and parcel of operational decisions that are made every day at Langley. This is especially true when it comes to covert action, the one CIA mission that makes us unique within the intelligence community, and I'll say a little bit more about that later. So the two main points I'd like to talk about in my remarks today. First, and this is nothing remarkable, is the idea that context matters, and it especially matters when discussing the practical application of ethics to national security policy. Without doubt, discussions about the moral obligations and legal standards of what Michael Walzer calls the wars of anticipation are valuable. But as Richard Betts of Columbia University has written, quote, "If one is interested in influencing the practice of governments in choosing preventive or preemptive attack as a policy, the key is to analyze the strategic wisdom or error of these military options rather than competing assertions about their legality." And I think when you talk about legality, you can also as was discussed earlier, talk about the relationship between morality and legality. Second, a primary role of intelligence is to help policymakers deal with uncertainty. But even the best and most accurate intelligence assessments are no substitute for moral reasoning. Secret information and analysis can help answer the questions that flow from just war criteria and from international law. Ultimately, however, it's the policymakers and military commanders that hold the greatest responsibility for how they use the information and judgments. On my first point, I think CIA and the intelligence community analysts were appropriately focused, as Beth suggests, on matters that help policymakers and warfighters determine how best to conduct the war. I will discuss later why this is an appropriate, if not the complete, role of intelligence. But I think it is important to note that part of the reason for the disregard of the should aspect at that time is that by early 2002, it seemed to many of us at the CIA and elsewhere that that question had already been answered. I mentioned that I'm not a philosopher or lawyer, but as a former military officer and military analyst at CIA, I was familiar with just war theory and the concepts of preventive and preemptive war. During the current academic year, I have the privilege of teaching ethics and moral reasoning to the third classmen here at the Naval Academy and have been reintroduced in more depth to these concepts in preparation for instructing my students. And despite this background, and this was discussed earlier this morning as well, I'm not sure I'm clear even now about how to think morally about the decision to launch Operation Iraqi Freedom. Because at the time, for many of us who had been involved with Iraq for years, it didn't seem so much that we were going to war, as someone else pointed out earlier, is that we were preparing to end an ongoing war. And I don't know the answer is if it's preemptive or preventive to start what might be called the final campaign of existing hostilities. As many of you probably know from firsthand experience, the U.S. military and CIA had been at war with Iraq since 1990. I recently found a BBC chronology of the U.S.-Iraqi conflict between 1990 and 2002 that included the incidents in the no-fly zones, the sanction enforcement measures, Iraqi military actions against the Kurds, 1998's Operation Desert Fox, and many other episodes. It was 12 pages long. In addition, as most of you are aware, regime change was the official U.S. policy through the Iraqi Liberation Act of 1998. From our perspective at the agency, or at least those of us working in Iraq, it seemed that the United States had been besieging Iraq for years. And while the cost to the U.S. was relatively low, I don't think no person with morals could be unsympathetic to the human cost to Iraq of this conflict. Unfortunately, as Joy Gordon of Fairfield University has recorded, the Iraq policies of 3 U.S. administrations and American bureaucratic practices resulted in what she called a type of indifference that contributed to the most severe sanctions ever imposed in the name of international governance, and that played a role in the humanitarian catastrophe that occurred in Iraq. As analysts, we understood the dilemmas faced by our policymakers in trying to press Iraq while protecting Iraqis against Saddam's ultimate culpability for their situation. But there was no denying that Iraqi civilians were suffering terribly because of the sanctions-based effort to stop Saddam and to keep him from rebuilding his military power. I don't think any group of people were more upset than the Iraq watchers of the intelligence community when then U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Madeleine Albright, made what she later admitted was a foolish comment about Iraq in a 1996 interview with the news show 60 Minutes. You may recall that in response to a question about the toll of sanctions on Iraq, she said that it was worth the lives of 500,000 Iraqi children to contain Saddam. Now, I don't know that 500,000 number has ever been authoritatively verified as the cost, but even as a hypothetical, and as she admitted, that's a question that needs a lot of thought, or an answer that needs a lot of thought by policymakers and those of us in the intelligence community. Clearly, by the 2000s, something had to give. I recall that there was a sense at CIA as early as the start of the George W. Bush administration that this siege must come to an end. Existing sanctions were unraveling, and the prospects for the new smart sanctions seemed dim. Situation put me in mind of John Wayne's line from the original True Grit. You can't serve papers on a rat, baby sister. You either kill him or let him be. And I don't think anyone at the time thought that the administration was inclined to let Saddam be. The sense of the need for a military solution only intensified after the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. Almost immediately, there were expressed concerns over the potential that Saddam would opportunistically create problems for the United States.